Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, and this is our second virtual summit series, United Actions for an Environmentally Just and Regenerative Future, United Climate Actions and Justice. This is the sixth and the last in the series. I'm Cheryl Davila, founder and chair of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force. Welcome to the city of Berkeley, Ohlone territory. Our office authored that legislation to change the city of Berkeley signs, and now Albany is going to add Ohlone territory to their signs. Praises. And, you know, I encourage everyone as an action to go to their city officials and get them to do the same for the territory that they are occupying. So it's been an amazing, eventful year, the last couple of years, actually. COVID has forever changed our lives. We're surviving. We're still here. But many of us, so many lives have been lost to COVID, lost to corporate greed, lost to institutional, systemic, structural, and environmental racism, lost to police killings of BIPOC human beings, lost to the mass killings, lost to the murder of Indigenous children and women. And there's been an increase in hate crimes for all ethnicities, not to mention the women's right to choose being challenged, the voting rights being stripped away, the economic instability, the pandemic variants, increasing homelessness and increasing criminalization of homelessness and no affordable housing. There's been increasing in addictions, overdoses, suicides, and sadly, white supremacy has increased as well. And COVID has allowed us to see all the effects of all the isms that's been going on for decades and centuries that have impacted our health and has showed us how those, extractive practices have impaired our lives. Not to mention the climate crisis. No one can deny that the heat, the cold, the drought, the tornadoes, the hurricanes, sea level rise, torrential rains, flooding, and so much more. It's so much. Wow. The last 2 years have really been something else. But here we are. Take a deep breath. We can get through this. Although COP was disappointing, COP 26, which we'll hear more about shortly. So who's ready to take action? Show me those reactions in your screen. Put a thumbs up, or because we have to do something. We have to stay engaged. We have to be in solidarity. We have to be united. United climate actions and justice is what we're doing today. And so now we're going to have, before that, I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank the CEMTF planning and logistics committees, all the steering committee. You all know who you are. I won't go through your names right now, but thank you so much. And then thank you to all the people that have donated, volunteered their time to help get these series live and going for all of you and whoever else wants to see it later. And thank you to all the speakers and that are here today. It's been, you know, a lot to get all these series going and the work that's gone in, and it's all volunteer based. So I want to thank you for donating and for being here. And now I would like to introduce my good friend and colleague, Karina Gould. She's the chair and spokeswoman for the Confederated Villages of Lejeune Ohlone. And Karina has worked on preserving and protecting the ancient burial grounds of her ancestors throughout the Bay Area for decades. She's the co-founder and co-director of Segurite Land Trust. And if you haven't paid your Shumi tax, I'm going to drop it in the chat. Do that. And remember, next time there's a event at the Shell Mound, or at any point in time, you can go to the Shell Mound, say a prayer, and acknowledge the ancestors that are here in Berkeley anyway on 4th Street. And there's the Shell Mound in Emeryville. They're everywhere. So acknowledge and thank you, Karina.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you everyone for being here this morning and for doing your part in trying to help us all as human beings come together to fight back and this climate disaster that we're all facing as human beings together. I just want to thank you also for inviting me every month that you've been meeting to be a part of this wonderful organizing and doing this work together. And so just my little part, I just want to bring us together in one mind so that we can do this work together. And it's a Friday, so we've all had these busy weeks and things that are coming, and then looking forward to a shorter week next week and spending time with our families or friends, or even if that means on a Zoom link. And so we want to just remind ourselves that we're in this together. And so every month, I think we wanted to do some deep breathing, and that's what I like to do to start off the morning, is to start off with some deep breaths and to remember some things that we do. And so I'd like to call in the 4 directions, the cardinal direction that we have, and the 4 cardinal directions actually come with some different teachings. And so we're going to breathe in the east, where the sun comes up. And the East is really about new ideas. It's about that time of birth, that time of newness in the springtime and times of babies, right? And so we're going to breathe that in, and we're going to bring in that light of those new ideas into this space today. So we could all take a deep breath for that. Let it go. We're going to move to the south, and in the south we're going to, that's that time of adolescence, that time of energy, that time of moving stuff, that time of excitement in our lives. And that's in that south direction. And we're going to bring that excitement and that joy with us into these spaces today. So we'll take a deep breath for that. And we move to the west. The west is that space where we have kind of settled in, that we have moved past that adolescent times into what we call adulthood, right? This time that we're in right now, that many of us are in, this time where we have some settled ideas, some ways of grounding ourselves into the work that we're doing, a way for us to be able to know the difference between rights and wrongs, and how we come to those spaces to do this good work together, that we have this mind that has settled into those things. And so we'll take a deep breath for those things right now. And as we move into the north, the space where we called elderhood, and some of us are maybe in that elderhood space, a time of wisdom, the time that we have seen a lot of things, but also a time of reflection, a time for us to rest as we go into this winter time. We look at that time as a time for us to reflect on the things that we need to do still, and hold on for that next cycle of the East coming in. And so we take a deep breath for that. And it's take in a deep breath for our rains and ask our cloud relatives to continue to come and to bring us fresh water for the next 7 generations and beyond. At the same time, we'll take in a deep breath for our airs, our winds that come, that they continue to bring us fresh air to breathe for the next 7 generations and beyond. We take in a breath for our Mother Earth and ask that her body continues to replenish in a way that gives us good foods and medicines for the next 7 generations and beyond. And as we move into this climate disaster, we ask our relatives, the fire, to come into right relationship with us again so that we can work with them and not to be fearful. We ask all of these things right now, and as we take this deep breath. And in this last deep breath, I want you to take it in for your mind, your body, your spirit, your health, that everything that you need is aligned and taken care of, that your families are taken care of, extended families are taken care of. We also remember our relatives that live without a roof over their head, that are cold and are hungry. We take a deep breath and ask for help for them as well. I want to thank you, relatives, for coming today to bring your minds together, your hearts together, your spirits together to do this amazing work. Thank you, Cheryl, for always inviting me to be a part of this. Thank you, Amos, for always coming together with this. It's been a blessing to be a part of this great circle with you.
Thank you so much, Karina. We feel blessed by your appearance, and every time I see you, I feel blessed. So thank you. It's an honor, and I'm humbled by your presence. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to give it to Amos, who's part of our steering committee and has been part of the CEMTF since the beginning. Thank you, Amos.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you so very much, Karina, again, for honoring us and bringing us into this space and making us present each and every time. So thank you. I have the honor of laying out the order of events for the day. My name is Amos White. This is our second annual and second virtual summit series, United Actions and Justice. We are the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, and we have, as Cheryl has pointed out, been organized since 2019. Today, we're going to hear from first our esteemed Congresswoman Barbara Lee in a recorded greeting and update from Congress. We do have some exciting news that they have passed this morning, just an hour ago, a little more than an hour ago, the Build Back Better plan. So we'll have greetings from her that will be playing here shortly. After that, we'll hear from our own here in Alameda County, Pamela Price, who's a civil rights attorney that will have remarks from. As you know, I'll introduce her shortly. After that, we will have our panel and speakers. An update on the COP26 from the inside and outside perspectives. Our co-founder, or one of the co-founders, Armando Davila, will be joined by Sarah Diefendorf, who's on our steering committee, as well as Elaine McCarthy, another steering committee member and on our legislative committees. Then we'll have a brief break at 10:35. And that'll be followed after a 5-minute break where we could have a bio break and stretch, followed up by Councilmember Paul Koretz of City of Los Angeles. Then at 11, after the council member, we'll have Kia Chatterjee, Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Action Network, and her remarks on the day. We'll wrap up shortly thereafter with closing remarks and a poll that we'll be issuing and be sharing our toolkit. Then Elaine McCarthy will join us again to introduce our toolkits that we've been presenting to you of links and resources that are relevant and useful and actionable now that you can take forward and share off to your networks, to your governments, to your constituents as regards this climate emergency, and how you could begin mobilizing where you are, whether it's on legislation, action, funding, and other exciting movements and actions you can take. Then we'll hear from, lastly, with 15 minutes left, from Jack Lucero-Fleck, who's our steering committee and also on our planning and logistics committee, who will issue our survey and take us through the survey for this evening, or for this morning, I should say. And then we'll have final remarks from, again, our chair, Cheryl Davila, in announcing how where we're moving forward to in the next year of 2022. So that's our day's events. With that, I have the honor of introducing first, having a greeting from Congresswoman Barbara Lee. If we have that queued up, please.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I proudly represent the 13th Congressional District of California, definitely one of the greenest districts in the country. Thank you to Jack, to Cheryl, and everyone else who is helping to organize the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force, and to thank you all for being here virtually for this very, very important summit. It's been a year since I last spoke at a task force meeting. At that time, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had just won after campaigning on the most ambitious climate plan ever proposed by a major party. And the question we were asking was, where do we go from here for climate justice? Now, I was hopeful because we would once again have an administration that recognized climate change as the ecological, economic, and humanitarian crisis that it is. And I was hopeful that President Biden would act with urgency, not just to reverse all of the damage done by the Trump administration, but also to lead our country and the world to finally leave behind fossil fuels and to take advantage of the short time that we have left to keep our planet healthy and habitable for future generations. Well, after the last 10 months of work and negotiation and sometimes frustrating compromise, we have reason to be hopeful. We have rejoined the Paris Agreement. The United States just led more than 100 countries to agree to a major cut in methane emissions at the COP26 in Scotland. And yes, we just signed an infrastructure bill that includes billions for environmental justice. For example, $55 billion for clean drinking water, $21 billion to clean up Superfund sites and cap orphaned oil and gas wells, $5 billion for low to no emissions buses, and hundreds of millions of dollars for California alone to expand its EV charging network. And we are now moving full speed ahead to vote on the Build Back Better Act, which will include the largest investment ever made to address the climate crisis head on. But we must face the reality that everything we have done so far this year is only one hard-fought step in the right direction, and it's not nearly enough. The Build Back Better Act will be a critical investment to limit warming before it's too late. But it won't be nearly enough unless we are able to continue this momentum and make a historic transition away from fossil fuels, a transition on the scale of another industrial revolution. I am certain we can do it, even in the face of a Republican Party that is almost universally opposed to any action that would help humanity survive this crisis. And as we do, we must make sure no one is left behind, especially those communities, the poor, people of color, and women who have always suffered the most during times of crisis. So thank you again to everyone here today for the work that you are doing to protect our state and our planet, and I look forward to working with you over the next year to continue this momentum for climate justice.
Thank you so very much, Congresswoman Lee, and very happy to hear the news and to know that you participated and helped the vote to pass this plan that our country so desperately needs. Next up.
Excuse me 1 second. Someone from Barbara Lee's office is here and he could actually give an update on the vote this morning. If he's available right now, Alex?
If you could highlight Alex there, Jack.
Is he here?
Hi, this is Alex. Can you hear me?
There you
Yes.
are. I'm on my phone. I'm sorry, my Zoom on my computer is not working. So if this works, so just a very quick update. As we all know, the bill passed this morning, which is great news. It's the top line points are that it's a $555 billion investment in clean energy and climate. The goal is what we're estimating is it will cut greenhouse gas pollution by over 1 gigaton by 2030. Going to create jobs. It's going to advance environmental justice, and it'll build on the infrastructure law that Congress just passed that is investing another $550 billion over 5 years. So the bottom line is largest investment in clean energy and in addressing the climate crisis that we've ever made or any country has ever made. And we see this as a start. We have to continue this, as the Congresswoman just said in that video, which was recorded. I'm sorry, it was recorded before they voted this morning. So, I just wanted to update that. But as she said in her video, this is not enough, not nearly enough, and we need to keep going. But it is, I think, something that we can take a moment to celebrate that it is the largest investment that we've ever made. So I'll just leave it at that unless anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the update. And thank you. Please thank Congresswoman for her participation today and to wish her a happy holidays. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to actually ask a question.
Actually,
Go
we'll
ahead.
take questions later on there. If Alex, are you still with us?
Yep. I am
One
still
question,
here.
go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, at the COP26, Abby Martin of the Empire Files asked Nancy Pelosi about restricting military or including military emissions in the COP26 negotiations. And I know Barbara Lee is a big anti-war proponent. And do you think that she could have proposed any legislation that would bring the U.S. military's impact into more into the fold in terms of how emissions reductions? Is that politically tenable?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's a good question. This month, Congresswoman Lee introduced legislation to do exactly that. What we introduced is a resolution that will make sure that the Department of Defense and the military, number one, monitor and report their use of greenhouse gas, their greenhouse gas emissions, which they're supposed to do by law, but they have not done yet. And then number two, this would require the Department of Defense to set emission reduction goals in line with the Paris Agreement and the National Defense Authorization Act for this fiscal year, and make a plan to meet those goals. So that's a great question, and we've already got that going through the process. So thank you.
Good. Thank you so very much, Alex, and send our regards to the Congresswoman yet again for her support and continued service and effort for the district.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from civil rights attorney Pamela Price. As many may know of Pamela and the work she has done here in Alameda County. She joined the civil rights movement when she was 13 years old and has been a survivor of the Ohio juvenile justice and foster care systems. She graduated from Yale University with a BA in political science, and also at Yale, she spent her junior year abroad in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in East Africa. She's been every year since 2004 as an attorney. Price has been named one of the top 5% of Northern California's super lawyers by San Francisco Magazine. And she's received numerous awards, including the African American Policy Forum's Pauli Murray Trailblazer Award in 2018, the National Lawyers Guild Bay Area Chapter Champion of Justice in 2016. And in 2017, she was honored as Assemblymember Rob Bonta and the California legislator as Woman of the Year for Assembly District 18. Pamela Price.
Thank you, Amos. And thank you, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this very important conversation. And I'm inspired by the words of Congresswoman Lee and the report. I have been a climate justice advocate for many, many years. In 2006, I joined a group of friends and we established a foundation called Friends Foundation International, and we regularly pool our resources and fund significant environmental projects around the world. And it's just us. We don't have overhead. We have a website, Friends Foundation International, and we use contributions from our friends and family to fund projects. We've done water distribution projects. We've helped lawyers fight for Indigenous rights around the planet. And we've done projects that support women and solar projects. And I remember in 2014, when I was a leader in the San Francisco Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and we brought Tom Steyer to San Francisco to talk to all these lawyers about what was then the climate emergency. And clearly, I understood at that point that the single thing that was facing us all, that would destroy us all if we did not address it, was the climate emergency, what is now the climate crisis. And we were able to bring that knowledge and enlightenment to lawyers in some of the big law firms in San Francisco. I think the next month I joined NextGen. So this is an important fight. It is a fundamental fight. And I think that it's so important. The framing that you all have presented for it is critical, because one of the things we have to understand that how we're fighting and what we're fighting stems from the need for Indigenous liberation, that we have to understand that we're confronting racism, that this emergency, this crisis stems fundamentally from white supremacy and the exploitation of people of color, the exploitation of land, the exploitation of resources. Amos mentioned, and thank you, Amos, for that introduction. He mentioned that I had an opportunity to live in Tanzania, East Africa, which at that time was one of the 10 poorest nations in the country, in the world. And I understood before I went there and as I lived there, the exploitation, it was called then the development of underdevelopment, and how the richer nations in this world basically exploited the resources and left everybody else poor. And we see that replicated on a global scale and on a local scale. When we look at communities such as Richmond, as West Oakland, we understand why some communities are wealthy and thriving and others are not. And it's about resources, and the misuse and the exploitation of resources is what has created the climate crisis. And so I was asked to talk about why it's important to elect leaders who are committed to environmental justice. And that is critical, because we need warriors in this arena. who are cognizant of the underpinnings of the climate crisis, the environmental exploitation of Native peoples, the economic exploitation of people of color in our labor, the creation of enclaves of exploitation of resources, and the globalization of essentially this exploitation, how it has fundamentally altered our relationship with the planet. And in the spaces that we call, where we elect people to go in and represent us, like Congresswoman Barbara Lee, like Congressman Roach Khanna, and when we look at the state level, we have to understand that those folks that are in that arena are fighting entrenched interests, entrenched politicians who, yes, have been bought and paid for by the fossil fuel industry, by the Chevrons, by the corporations that are benefiting. And what we see here locally is just a small sliver of an international endeavor that exists all around us. One of the things that I really loved about Friends Foundation International is we were looking around the world at the struggles of, for instance, the Yuwa people in Colombia, for looking in Tanzania and understanding that the little bit of resources that we had could make a huge difference in places that had no access to capital, that were essentially being exploited and dominated by these international corporations that put a smile on here at home, you know, and that look like they're doing, you know, great beneficial things in our community, but we know they're robbing and killing and stealing around the world. And that's what you have to understand when you're in this arena, fighting for climate justice, fighting for environmental justice, that it requires more than leaders who will pay lip service to environmental justice and say, yes, I'm for that. It requires more than leaders that will take you into the halls of power and then leave you at the door when they go in the back room to negotiate the deal, right? And that's what we see, not only in Sacramento, but in Washington too often. There's a commitment to us at the door coming down the hallway, but when they get to the door, they go into the room, they go behind closed doors, they cut a deal because there is a lack of moral leadership. There is a lack of courage to address the real issues that are impacting us and to get to the heart of it. And so what will it mean for us to elect warriors for environmental justice? It means that we have to have people who are willing to empower movements and empower activists such as you all, that are willing to not only partner with us, but to empower us, to get us the resources we need, to fight the battles that have to be fought across the board, that we have to challenge the Democratic Party, as we have, from accepting fossil fuel money and recognizing that those interests are intertwined with police money, that those interests are intertwined, that they are all about maintaining a system of injustice and exploitation that has to be challenged, that we are fundamentally challenging the status quo, and that we have to continue that battle. And we need people in those rooms, behind those doors, that are about doing that and that understand how fundamental it is to recognize that we have a long, long history, that this country is founded upon the extermination and the genocide of indigenous peoples, that this country is founded upon enslaved labor and using the exploitating Black and brown people, that this country, that this land does not belong to Chevron. This land does not belong to the multinational corporations that are in partnership around the world. It's not theirs, it's ours. And so we need elected officials that recognize that are willing to fight for that, and that are fundamentally diametrically opposed to the structures and the systems that have been utilized to suck the blood from the land and have left us where we are right now. And it is going to take a huge amount of effort, all of us, to turn this around. And we don't have long, as we know. We are in a crisis, and fundamentally, it's all about working for our children and what world are we going to leave for them. And I'm inspired by the young people in these different movements, in Next Gen, in the Sunrise Movement, who are not taking no for an answer and who are not going to allow people who are complicit with these multinational corporations and with these entrenched entrants to basically preside over our death, that they're not willing to do that. And so I applaud you today for taking the time, not just now, but over the years, as you've been engaged in this movement. We all have to do whatever we can because we don't have a planet B. I saw they were looking for a planet B. I'm like, really? We don't have a planet B. Okay, this is the planet. And we owe it to our children. We owe it to the land. We owe it to our ancestors and to the legacy of struggle in this country for us to win this battle. So thank you for having me. And let's keep it going. I'm honored to be in fellowship with you today. I'm honored to be on the program. I'm honored to be in the race right now to represent you in this community, to really make fundamental change about how we address our environmental issues on a local level as well as nationally. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela Price. You're amazing. And I'm gonna look up this Friend Foundation International. That's amazing. I had no idea.
We'll find it and drop the link in.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful to hear your words, and I'm hoping for good news in 2022.
We got this.
That's good.
Yes,
Good.
Thank you.
Next, and thank you again, Pamela. Next, we'll again just a quick rundown. We're ahead of schedule, which is good. So that gives us more time to get into the meat of the day. We'll start off next with our panels and speakers, and then around 10:35 in about an hour, we'll take a short break before hearing from I advanced his title, Councilmember Paul Corrects, and then from Kia Chatterjee. But next, we're going to dive into our panel. It's on COP26, Inside and Outside Perspectives. As you all know, COP26 just ended, and there's mixed emotions, mixed opinions. And it was kind of rather framed well, both by the Congresswoman, but also by Pamela in regards to the deals that are cut, or how publicly things are presented, but really where's the beef, if you will, the substance with the changes that need to be made now, and the investments that will be as goals that have been pushed for and set. In the words of one of our own, Leonard Joy, who's a steering committee member with the CEMTF, he stated that COP26 needs to face the reality presented in the Kamen report that we have read, that moving above 1.5 Celsius of global warming could mean that continued increase would be irreversible, and that on our persistent path, irreversibility would face us sometime between 2027 and 2042. As Pamela said, the time is now. And this organization really is presenting the call to action to all governments, to all NGOs, and to you as individual leaders. As you hear from this next panel, we hope you find that sense of urgency in the reports that they're going to have here on COP26. We'll hear from Armando Davila, who has just returned, as well as Sarah Diefendorf and Elaine McCarthy. Please.
And I think I'm up first, Amos.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
There.
All righty. Let me share my screen, get things set up here. And good morning, everybody. And really glad to be here. We just got back a few days ago, so apologies if sometimes our brains are a little fuzzy headed. It was a long and sometimes strange trip. And I'm going to share that with you now. I'm just trying to get the video panel hidden and my, it doesn't want to do it. Okay, so we're just going to start from here. And I'm going to start with an overview and basically just give you an idea of what it is to be at COP, just sort of writ large. And then Elaine is going to dig down a little bit deeper as to what she and I tried to accomplish there. And Armando is going to give you the perspective from outside COP. And so starting with the road to COP26, which for us was a lot bumpier than we had expected. So this literally is the road to COP26, because as we did our 10-hour flight, got into London, ready to board the train to Glasgow, it apparently happened that there was a huge windstorm that swept through sort of the Midlands of England, knocked out power lines on the trains, knocked down trees on the tracks. And they say that they actually had one of those English tornadoes you often read about. Yeah, not right. So kind of the perfect introduction to climate change was not being able to get to COP because of a tornado hit England. So anyhow, we got on the train, we went, well, I think we sat on it for about 4 hours, only to get about 45 minutes outside of London, spent the night there, and ended up hitting the road because we just didn't even trust that trains were going to be going the next day. This is the beautiful British countryside. And there we were, crammed inside a little Mini, the Mini Cooper, 3 women, that's our colleague, Rosemary Atieno, who's part of the Women's Climate Centers International, one of our other projects. She joined us, and 3 women, 3 huge suitcases and a tiny Mini drove across the UK to get to Glasgow. Thank you, Elaine, for braving the left-hand side of the road and doing the driving. So getting into COP every single day was always a challenge. Just to give you an idea as to why we get to go. We are part of Earth Island Institute, which is our fiscal sponsor. They have observer status with the UNFCCC. And because of that, they get basically 3 to 4 passes every year to attend COP. And those passes can be split by weeks. I was full-time on Earth Island. Elaine was also part of the US Climate Action Network delegate, which you will hear from Kaya Chatterjee a little bit later on about USCAN, and she had a week on their observer status as well. But we were allowed to be in because we were considered observers and had that status, which is probably about the lowliest status you can have at COP. Before getting in any given day, we COVID tested every single day. This is what a negative COVID test looks like when you're trying to get in, and you just kind of pray that a second little lighter red line doesn't show up by that T, which says that you are positive. We entered that information into the National Health Service every single day and got a text from them, which allowed us to get past the first level of security so that we could join the crowds trying to get into COP. This was actually just the first 3 or 4 days. It eased out over time, but the first few days are always insane. And many people, especially observers, spent about 3 to 4 hours in line just trying to get in. So this COP presidency, right? Every COP has a different presidency, a different country that hosts it. And those countries get to decide who gets in, right? Obviously the delegates get in, but how many NGOs get in, right? How many observers get in? It's up to the presidency. And according to the COP presidency, primarily the UK, this was going to be the most inclusive COP26 ever. And every single NGO would say, bull. And I'm going to leave it at that. It was probably the most exclusive COP I've ever been to. And Elaine is going to dig into that a little bit more deeply, I believe. But it was pretty difficult as we talked, as Pamela talked about closed doors. There were a lot of closed doors for us. Some just short little attendance stats. Over 44,000 registered for COP this year, and it was the highest ever, which is kind of strange because they kept us out of lots of things because of COVID. And so COVID and 44,000 and the highest ever registered doesn't really make sense until you realize that, well, they did have to make room for the over 500 people coming in that represented oil and gas at COP. Some of the key issues, very broadly, keeping things to 1.5 degrees. I'm not going to go into that. I think we know the answer to that one. Transparency and how governments can share data and information about how they are performing with reducing emissions and whether or not they are being transparent and how do you guarantee transparency. And then adaptation finance was also one of the big issues, getting countries to pitch in to pay for adaptation. Also, loss and damage was a big piece, probably the primary piece of why we were there, to promote adaptation and loss and damage finance. It kicks off with a 2-day World Leaders Summit. Everybody was there, everybody but Putin, Bolsonaro, and Xi Jinping, which kind of leaves you wondering exactly where you can get to when especially Putin and Xi Jinping were not there, although at the end there was some sort of murky, bland deal between Biden and China. But basically the first 2 days are leaders coming in, saying lots of wonderful things, and that's about it. They leave. And then the real work starts. Okay, so in the first 2 days, you have the leaders speaking, just a little bit on the venue, which made it even doubly difficult for us. This doesn't tell you much. The venue was absolutely huge. What this does tell you is of the maybe 100 or so places where you could go for a session, they didn't really tell you where they were. This map doesn't tell you where they were. And so a lot of us spent sometimes hours every day wandering around the venue trying to figure out where we were supposed to be. And sometimes you got to where you were supposed to be and were informed that it was virtual. And oh, by the way, we can't get you signed into the virtual. Right. So again, it was really, it was a challenge to get around the venue. Within that venue, this is very typical. There are always a lot of pavilions. And this year there were 80 pavilions. So everything from the Adaptation Fund to Brazil, to the Africa Pavilion, to Adaptation Hub, to Turkey, to Tuvalu, the Water Pavilion, of course, the United States, which had like 3 different hubs, and so on. And so there's a lot going on. And all of these hubs obviously have their own agendas that they are trying to promote. At the same time, you have sessions. And sessions, there are literally hundreds of learning sessions inside every single day. And so you have UNFCCC sanctioned side events, which any observer organization can actually apply to do a side event. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be accepted. The U.S. Climate Action Network was accepted for a loss and damage side event. Earth Island also had a side event. There are pavilion events. So you saw those 80 some odd pavilions. Each one of them has almost every half hour or hour of every day their own events. So add to that 80 other events on top of the hundreds or so UNFCCC events. So there literally are a couple hundred events that you could possibly attend in any given hour. There are funder events, which you might get to, or you might be kept out. In most cases, you're kept out. There are exclusive events. I can't tell you really much about them because they're exclusive and we weren't invited. There are plenaries and negotiations, which I could actually just group with the exclusive events because for the most part, none of us, the NGOs, were really able to get into the plenaries and the negotiations, even to be an observer and hear. Those were pretty much closed. The excuse being, of course, COVID, but then we have to remember they let 44,000 people attend. And then there were hundreds more events happening outside. So all of the events that happen inside have some sort of permutation happening outside. The inside was considered the blue zone. The outside was an area for protest, for other events to happen. And then there was a larger public space called the green zone, where people could go in and get some of the similar sessions that we were able to get in the blue zone. The New York Times had a hub there and so on. So it's a huge learning opportunity. It's a huge learning event that, at least in this case, they shared with the public of Scotland. Every day has a theme. So to give you an idea of how the sessions work and what are going to be given, what presentations are going to be given on any given day: finance, adaptation, loss and damage, energy, gender, transport, youth and public empowerment, science and innovation, nature, and cities, regions, and built environment. So these are the topics, one per day. There'll be, like I said, hundreds of sessions that sort of are generated around those topics. If it's coming from the United States, you might get the agreement on Energy Day between the US and Romania to build a new nuclear power plant. From Tuvalu, you might get something completely different, right? So lots and lots of agendas. And then we also had our own agenda. As I said, we were very focused on loss and damage and climate reparations. And this was the USCAN presentation that came on a Saturday. Interestingly enough, my feeling is because the word reparations was in there, we got sent to a Saturday afternoon, which meant not a whole lot of people attended, but Ed Markey was there. And Ed Markey said something very, very interesting to kick off the event, which was he admitted that the United States was largely responsible for climate change. That's not something that you hear from most elected officials. And this was our incredibly awesome panel speaking to loss and damage. And then at the same time, there were other things going on. Like I said, sessions at the US Climate Action. This is what you would imagine a session to be and what you hope a session to be. Interestingly enough, the US Climate Action Center hosted Indigenous Resistance on Minnesotans and Line 3 pipeline, which was, I think, a surprise to all of us. It was probably the only activist presentation we saw at any of the US Climate Action or US Climate, US centers, any of the US represented pavilions. Adaptation Fund was another one that we attended, but by and large, if anything was super popular, this is where you were, because all the primary seats were there for special people, and most of us stood in the back with headphones on, just trying to see who speaks. Meetings, meetings, meetings. Yes, we had them constantly. This was the youth delegation. You can't really tell from here, but this is actually the cafeteria because it was impossible to get meeting rooms. This is the USCAN delegation also meeting in the cafeteria or sitting on the floor outside the room we were supposed to get, but they took it away from us at the last minute. But then we found out we weren't allowed to sit on the floor either, and they kicked us off the floor and we had to go find a new space, right? So this speaks to the exclusivity and the difficulties they made for the NGOs who attended. This is a great example of someone who is using ingenuity, a table with a chair on top of it, with a backpack on top of it, with a computer on top of it to find a quiet space to do a Zoom call. This is kind of pretty typical of what you see. There were the superstars. We had John Kerry, we had Gina McCarthy, we had various senators and House members, including Nancy Pelosi, we had AOC, we had Michael Regan, we had Deb Haaland, and of course, this guy. But because we were NGOs, that's about all you could see of any of those people. USCAN did have a small delegation presence or informational session with the US congressional delegation and Pelosi, but we were limited to 10 people. And that tended to be pretty typical of how that worked. We had our own little superstar. That was Rosemary Atieno, who gave multiple reports and interviews on what it is to be a woman in rural Africa and how it is that we are trying to support them in climate resilience. But we were usually forced to go into Big Licks, which was the ice cream shop down the street outside of security, in order to get those interviews to happen. There were internal protests, not nearly the same as outside. So you had Tuvalu with a wonderful exhibition here. But then by and large, this is pretty much what you saw: children painting and a loss and damage die-in that happened just about the last day. All inside protests had to be approved by the UNFCCC, and many of them, including one that USCAN wanted to do, were denied. And if you actually had a protest that was denied and you did it, you were kicked out. So finally, getting home, the question of the entire time at COP was, where the hell do you get a PCR test? What is a PCR test? Because all of a sudden that is required to get back into the United States. Thankfully, we had brought ours with us, but that was kind of a side discussion through the entire COP, was now how do we get home? And then finally, we winged our way and we got back on Saturday. So that's the broad overview, and I'm now going to pass it on to Elaine.
Thank you, Sarah. And I just need 1 second to queue up my presentation and share it. Let's see. And okay, does that look all right?
It's good.
Okay. All right. Well, I I'm starting off this presentation from my own experience, right? This is my story. And so I'm calling it COP26, Obstruction and Obfuscation on Climate Finance, because that's what I was there focused on. And it's really about where the world's wealthiest countries are continuing to drag their feet on the climate crisis, as millions of people around the world, those most impacted by climate change more than ever, continue to not see funds make their way to combat climate change. And so, as Sarah already mentioned, this was a key issue of the many, and that many people leading up to COP were trying to build some awareness of this as a key issue. Particularly, there was a rallying call for people in the climate movement to increase climate finance around loss and damage and climate adaptation. So this was my third year at COP. And so I was there particularly focused on advancing finance for the world's most impacted around the issue of climate finance. And I just want to point out that Sarah was talking about the internal protests that you had to file a request to actually do. And I saw these people doing their formally filed protest and getting harassed by security, even though they were complying, as far as I could see, with what was required. Okay, why can't I advance? Let's see. All right, so a little background. My interest and motivation for promoting climate finance emerges from my role as co-director of Women's Climate Centers International, which Sarah also referenced. She's co-director of this organization with me, where we're applying women-led adaptive measures and building resilience for climate change in East Africa. So it's largely through that lens that I participated in COP. And so in this role, I started investigating the lack of adaptation finance over a year ago, probably about a year and a half ago, when I realized the enormous challenges to funding climate adaptation to help people in developing countries who are experiencing the flooding, the droughts, other extreme events, as well as those long-term damages and consequences that we think of as loss and damages, and their inability to access the financing. So there's literally a dearth of funding available to these vulnerable communities. And even when financing is available, it doesn't reach those most impacted. It mainly lies within the hands of government agencies, large consulting firms, and international NGOs, particularly those in the global north. So when I became particularly focused on these finance issues, I started looking into the UNFCCC mechanisms, which includes the GCF, oh my gosh, now I'm gonna space on there. There's several mechanisms, including the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, and the Global Environmental Fund. But I was looking into all these, and all of the mechanisms are pretty much inaccessible to NGOs in the global south and to local people. The hurdles that one needs to jump through in order to access these funds are enormous. And if I have questions about that, I'd be happy to speak more to it. But anyhow, so one of the mechanisms that I was looking at was the Adaptation Fund. And so through US Climate Action Network and CAN International, I was able to participate in the Adaptation Committee's annual meeting in September. And I got some insights at that point leading up into COP into what the needs are of the Adaptation Fund. And a lot of what I heard was about operational issues, but ultimately those operational issues exist because of the lack of finance. And the Adaptation Fund itself and the committee doesn't have oversight into the finance. So all roads lead ultimately to finance and to a body of the UNFCCC, which is, and COP, which is the Finance Committee. Okay, so fast forward to COP, and through the Climate Action Network International and the US node known as USCAN, which Sarah's already referenced, I was able to get a pass through USCAN for at least one of the weeks to COP. And also through these organizations, I had access to enormous learning about all the mechanisms within COP. There's committees within both the international organization and within the US node, where you can really dig in and learn more about not only COP and not only the UNFCCC mechanism, but also what's going on in the ground real time. And so during COP, there were calls with these committees and with these organizations where day to day they were following what was happening within negotiations and these different rather exclusive meetings that, as Sarah described, were really pretty impossible for most of civil society to enter, but you could still track them through participating in these organizations. And the other thing that was made available through USCAN was the ability to interact with the US State Department. So in the calls with the US State Department, specific requests could be made by civil society. And what I was asking for, and other members of USCAN, I believe, was to see the balance of adaptation finance, which in the Paris Agreement is very vague. The only specificity, in fact, really the only mention of what that adaptation finance would be is to say it has to be balanced. And so I don't think that's good enough. Many people agree with me, or I guess I agree with other people on this matter, and that balance should be quantified. And so we were asking that the new negotiated text would be specific and state that the balance should be 50% mitigation and 50% adaptation. And also what we were asking for is recognition that local people, including indigenous people or local peoples anywhere, that they're actively engaged in adaptation planning and all aspects of adaptation planning and implementation, and that the funding actually reach them. So according to a study by IIED, only globally about 20% of all financing goes towards adaptation. And out of that small pool, only somewhere between 5 and maybe 8% reaches local people. So you can see that that's a problem. And I also could speak more to just the challenges. I spoke to the person at COP who actually did that study. And I could speak to more to just the challenges of even unraveling what those numbers are. And that speaks to one of the other issues that I wasn't really involved in, but that's the transparency issue that I think Sarah mentioned on one of her first slides. So, okay, so Sarah mentioned the different types of events that we attended, and actually on the day Saturday when the USCAN event was happening on a Saturday, on a day that was not very accessible on reparations, that same evening there was an event by the Adaptation Fund on adaptation and different activities. I think there were 8 countries that were speaking about what they were doing. And so there was a very little bit of time at the end for Q&A. And I didn't really mean to do this, although I'm kind of glad I was able to get people to stop and think, because I asked how can we get, why is it that only 6% of funding reaches local and grassroots level, and what are they going to do about it? It seemed like a pretty simple and straightforward question to me, but really it was met with crickets. There wasn't really much anybody could say, except a woman on the committee who's pictured here, who is, I believe, from Costa Rica, who had just agreed to adopt the 8 principles of locally led adaptation. And she spoke, I think, very generously about their recent commitment to adhering to locally led adaptation principles. So that was good news. Sarah didn't talk about this too much, but we were very active on Twitter and Facebook. You could, if you're interested, you could see our EFC West Twitter page and Facebook page, as well as Women's Climate Centers International. So we were tweeting and posting on that, and trying to spread the word, and also trying to spread the word about many of our partners and fellow CAN members. So here's just one example. And the Union of Concerned Scientists was particularly focused on really making sure and communicating that, you know, the world's largest contributors to CO2 are still not taking responsibility for their contribution, and particularly stepping up to the plate with climate finance. I think these 2 headlines summarize pretty well my sentiments about COP, and probably the sentiments of most of civil society, that the rich nations betray vulnerable people. They're not giving their fair share. And these headlines came at the tail end of COP, really on the closing days, as you can see from the dates. And people feel betrayed. There's no other way to put it, I think. And I could speak more to this, but I think Pamela Price did a lovely job just a few minutes earlier explaining why people feel so strongly about this, that it's really the exploitation of people and resources that have made the global north and the United States and many other countries wealthy, and yet have really not only do they remain poor, made them poorer as a consequence of that exploitation. But I think Pamela did a great job earlier on that. I was going to speak a little bit to this, but Sarah talked about all the other different events that were going on. From my perspective, I was very busy in funding meetings, meeting with our funders, meeting with potential partners, and actually meeting in many cases, for people that I've been on Zoom calls for 1.5 years, 2 years, that I finally got to meet in person. And sometimes connecting with people that I think of as thought leaders in the climate activist arena, like the gentleman pictured here in the bottom right, Salim Hook, who I met several years ago and continue to follow on social media and email with from time to time. And then finally, we were there supporting our colleague, Rosemary Atiano from Women's Climate Centers International. She bravely traveled from Uganda, and of all the obstacles that Sarah and I faced to get to COP, I would just say that she faced many more. And she had quite a few presentations there, and I'm just very proud to have been able to, when possible, make her visit and her travels to COP and her participation meaningful. So as you can tell, I'm pretty disappointed. Many of us are. I think most, if not all, of civil society and the NGO world are disappointed. We're disappointed in the US. I think things could have been worded a lot stronger. I should say that in regards to the adaptation finance, the requests that were made and what actually made it into the final text, it was very weak. And this is where the obfuscation term comes into play. While we were asking for specifics and more balanced climate finance, including a commitment from the United States to really pony up, because right now, I think of all of United States climate finance, I think I think less than 20% was going to adaptation. And then even, actually, I think it was about 12%. And then even with Biden's promise and commitment leading, like at the very beginning of COP, he committed to doubling it. That still leaves the US at only about 25% of its total funding. So it's grossly inadequate, in my opinion, and many others. And so I want to leave, though, folks, with one positive note. And I think where this all comes down is we still need to think globally. We need to act locally. And as far as climate action goes, I think while it's really important for those who can make it to participate in the summits and in these global activities, I think what we do at home is more important. And that's why I remain committed to the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force and why I continue to do the work that I'm doing here. And I think I need to hand off to Armando, or we're going to take a Q&A.
Yeah, I was going to say, before you do, can you speak to two key points, if you don't mind? First, I was looking at, that was Sarah's question, but she addressed that. One, can you really address, if you can, with all degree of delicacy, the challenges that your colleague had to go through from Uganda that you compared to yours? There's a couple dynamics going there that are being covered, and I think if you could share that, it helps put it into perspective with people.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so for somebody from Africa to even get a visa to the UK is already difficult enough. So categorically, she couldn't enter the UK without the letter from the UNFCCC stating that she was a delegate. We had complications with getting that letter and then ensuring that the letter was going to be adequate. She had to travel from a rural location in, in Kenya to Nairobi to apply for her visa, which creates additional economic hardships on her, as well as time. And then she had to go back home and then go back to get the visa. And then in order to get her COVID vaccines, I mean, and this is disparities in the COVID-19 crisis, right? Is that access to the vaccines is very difficult. But she was able to get it, but she had to travel really long distances. So I would just say she probably spent about 7 full days traveling to fulfill all of these criteria and obligations to make sure she was going to be able to get on her flight and fly to Glasgow.
Right.
Yeah, I would also add to that, that up until really just about the last 2 weeks, all red states, and she was from a red state, red country, were going to have to quarantine for 10 days. And so we had to make plane reservations for her that included 10 days of quarantine in the UK before she could even get out. But then right at the last minute, they canceled that quarantine. They canceled almost all red countries, but then of course we had to change the flight, which added to costs and so on. So it was just, and you know, we were able to help her. Imagine people who had no help and had to go through this process. They made it impossible for the Global South.
And this is all about access and voice, and something both you touched on. And we really, and I don't know if somebody will or can eventually, just to throw it out there, comment on it, the artists and activism and that role in terms of voice and that perspective, as what the picture you've depicted is what barriers have actually been erected, even from not having you be able to sit on the floor where you were peacefully convening in an open space. But that's why it really caught my attention when you mentioned, you alluded to the barriers, but I wanted you to be more descriptive so people can get a better idea of, truthfully, hurdles that are put up in your way to actually seemingly suppress, if you will, voice participation and even arrival there. And it's very real. It's a challenge you go through. So again, heroic that all three of you have did make it there and did get a chance to participate within that. You had one other question, Elaine. Can you comment on GFANS? Can you tell us first what GFANS stands for? And then can you comment on that and other financial institutions on their role to engage private investors It says, by finance, do you include loans as well as pay for them?
Yeah, okay, I might take those in reverse order, but
Okay.
starting with types of climate finance. I have been using that term very globally.
GFANs?
No, climate finance.
Oh, climate finance.
Yeah, to include both private and public finance. Public finance normally in the NGO world is referring to grants, but there's other types of public finance that aren't necessarily grants. As far as private investors go, I mean, look, I view that as part of the problem. I mean, part of the problem is that you're asking developing countries that are already incredibly indebted due to structural racist and problems and exploitation. They're already indebted. And then you're creating financial mechanisms so they can get further indebted just to respond to climate change that there wasn't even their doing. So I just view this as a fundamental issue. So I didn't get into it in my presentation, but I am supportive of public financing and particularly more grants. And then as far as I think the GFANs, I think they might be asking actually the GCF. I don't know what GFANs is.
Okay.
But the GCF is the GCF. Sarah, help me out here. The Global
Finance.
Climate Finance,
Global Climate Fund.
Global Climate Fund. And actually, sometimes they substitute the word fund with facility. So that's the other thing that gets me hung up, because it's actually the Green Climate Facility, and it's the Green Climate Fund. I mean, the
Green Climate Fund.
the Global Environmental Facility and the Green Climate Fund.
Thank
Right.
you.
My
And-
apologies.
Good.
GFANs, I had to look it up, is Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which I don't think we crossed, but it's private financial institutions committed to accelerating decarbonization, which we have our own deep mistrust of private financial institutions doing anything that is incredibly favorable towards the global south.
Very well put. And thank you again, ladies. With that, if you want to pass the mic, Elaine.
Yeah.
Well,
And I have to, and I
go
just
ahead.
say
That's
one
what I was
thing.
going to say. Please do.
I have to apologize that Sarah and I have to leave the call. And so if you have additional questions, please include them in the chat or funnel them, and we'd be happy to try to get to them at another time.
Thank you again, and safe travels. Armando.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
You're on mute. Now we can hear you.
Cool. I got to have the honor and privilege of actually meeting up with Sarah and Elaine there. We caught dinner and they told me a little bit of the story about what was going on inside. I went as an individual, not a part of any organization, without the intention of going inside the blue zone. I had the good fortune of being offered a free place to stay by an 80-year-old Scottish woman who happened to be a retired doctorate in physics from Stanford. And I sent her my resume of all the stuff I've done around climate change. And she was like, okay, you could stay here. So that was a very fortunate experience for me through my network I got for this contact. And but I had heard that housing was a big problem over there because there were so many people coming to town that there was price gouging. I mean, people had confirmed Airbnbs, which then canceled on them and then tried to charge them a higher price. So there's also some complexities there. One thing I'll say about Scotland in general and the event they did, the civil society events also had testing requirements. So you had to present a negative COVID test from that day to get into the civil society events, which coming from here in the United States was very impressive because they're giving out boxes of 7 tests for free to anyone. And they were doing contact tracing. So you had to check into the events as well as present your negative test to get in. So that was a very positive experience around COVID safety. There was a lot happening throughout the city. It was kind of like a climate festival happening in Glasgow for the 2 weeks. I ended up meeting a lot of people, a lot of activists. I had the privilege of being primarily around activists and having done, 6 years of pretty focused climate activism here in the Bay Area, I got pretty burnt out. because of racist, classist, kind of neoliberal dynamics where people say they're about one thing, but then they aren't. And so I went there mainly to get replenished in my reservoir to keep working on this issue. And that largely did happen. There was a really strong showing of Indigenous people. One organization I would recommend everyone check out is the NDN Collective, 3 letters, NDN. They presented some panels and they're doing really great work here in the United States. And then another Indigenous group is, I think it's Minga International. It's like a coalition of Indigenous groups. But and I also, another thing that was really heartwarming to see was Extinction Rebellion. I don't know how you're familiar with the United Kingdom Direct Action Group, Extinction Rebellion. I got to witness some of their protests firsthand. And they were really beautiful, really organized, really coherent. They had excellent speakers. They had excellent tactics, such as really clear branding, really clear banners. They gave really good directions on what to do and when. Everyone brought Tupperware because it's a tradition to bring Tupperware to a direct action or XR protest because they know that there'll be food. They have dedicated cooks that cook for every action, which I found really heartwarming, something we don't do. So they weren't relying on disposable materials. And the first protest I went to after a discussion about nuclear arms and kind of an anti-war group, I got the pleasure of meeting one of the co-founders of Code Pink. And the XR group gathered in front of the Home Office, which they call the Immigration Office, and made some connections around migration and climate change and the United Kingdom's policies. I saw a woman holding a sign that said "End Fortress Europe," and what I presume that to mean is their policy around immigration. Letting people die on boats who are trying to get in from various ecological, economic, and social crises, which undoubtedly had something to do with the West's intervention globally and climate change. And then they marched to BAE Systems. BAE Systems, it's a company that is in the United States and in Scotland, and they're kind of a military contractor. They develop BAE with the B, it's in butterfly. They develop military weapons, gear, technology. So they're a big military contractor, and they get contracts with the United States. And so we marched a very long walk to their building, and had some excellent speakers making the connection between militarism and climate change. And I saw several speakers who actually made this connection, and it was one of the things that was my main takeaway. In addition to the excellent framing by Pamela Price and Elaine and Sarah, the power dynamic right now is very, very unequal. And if you look at the United States' spending, there's far more spending going towards our military, the Pentagon, and various forces than any kind of climate mitigation and adaptation, both in our own country or for those folks in the rest of the world. And so it's also true in the United Kingdom, who is hosting the conference. And what I realized is that the military knows full well what's happening, and so do our leaders. And essentially, they're planning for the climate chaos. They're planning to secure their borders. They're planning to have all the military weapons they need for any kind of resource wars that may occur. And so what it means is that, national security over planetary well-being was a phrase that I heard one activist say, even though the highest form of national security is planetary well-being. And so that was a very harsh but honest takeaway for me, is that we're in a state of allowing the world to somewhat be genocided through complex factors of social, economic, and ecological collapse and global warming. And we're planning on securing our borders in the face of that while we're exacerbating the problem, because it would only take a few cycles of military spending to fund the whole transition and a lot of the adaptation. So there's many speakers that spoke to that. There's many Indigenous speakers. I spent the first few days crying often. I cried many times there. Just the Indigenous people there were very much speaking from their relationship to the land, speaking about their experiences having these foreign corporations coming in and killing them and stealing their land, burning it, deforesting it. And there's a lot of really powerful Indigenous women who spoke. And it was just a very moving experience. I also went to the Fridays for the Future protest, which was the youth strike that had really excellent turnout. And then on November 6th, there was an international march. I guess people were marching all over the world. And there's, I think on Friday, there's about 30,000, and maybe on Saturday, maybe about 100,000. So it was like a very, very, very large turnout. And the people in Scotland were really there for it. They were largely down. People were really kind and generous. They were very accommodating. They understood that thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were flooding into their city, and they understood the severity of the crisis, and they were very supportive. And it was very relaxing, actually, just to be in Scotland. I felt like they had a whole different nervous system ecology. I heard they have some economic challenges there. Like there's a lot of poverty in the city of Glasgow. But overall, people were really, really kind and warm and generous. It was, so some of the topics that I saw was about degrowth, the idea that we need to scale back the economy so that it fits the size of the planet, which Cheryl Davila proposed. She and I worked on when she was in office to have the San Francisco Bay Area, the 9 counties, shift their development trajectory to include bioregional sustainability as well as planetary sustainability, so that we don't consume more resources than the earth can handle here at home. But when she lost her reelection campaign, Kate Harrison and Terry Taplin and another fellow decided to kill that item. One thing I was happy to report is that there was a lot of partying actually that happened. People were kicking it pretty hard. You know, it's a very stressful event, and it's an international convergence of people. So there's a lot of networking, and I met a lot of different people and got to get some quality time with them. And it was a very rich and engaging experience. They had a really good bike share program. So you could just download an app and get a bike and use it for like the first half hour free. I think one bike I forgot to lock. And so for the use of 7 hours, it costs £10. So they have a very functional bike sharing program there, which was really impressive. The vibe was just very coherent and unified. There was a lot of artists, like some group of people had developed some paper mache hats of Bolsonaro and Trump and someone named Morrison and some other leaders, and they were marching around in chains saying that they were climate criminals. And then there's also some people who wheat pasted COP welcomes climate criminals. And then there was rallies in front of the entrance to the Blue Zone. So I saw a rally by some Indigenous people from Brazil being supported by Extinction Rebellion, and then some Indigenous women from Latin America. And so in that sense, there was a really beautiful cross-cultural integration. Also, some people from Ecuador lit a fire at this venue called the Hidden Gardens. And they kept the fire there for 2 weeks. And it was mostly Indigenous people, international people, but predominantly Scottish people. And they invited the Scottish family to come up and kind of like be a part of the ceremony. And they talked about how they'd never been to that land before, and they wanted to establish a relationship with the land and the people. So there's this really beautiful cross-cultural exchanges that were happening. And the vibe was just very loving and supportive. And so even though, there's gross injustice in terms of the national dynamics and the international dynamics, the United States, United Kingdom's foreign policy in terms of climate change, the civil society response was very, very, very unified. And that made me very happy. And it was very heartwarming to experience that. Some other experiences I like to report on was the children in Scotland. The children in Scotland were very happy to see the various climate activities. There's a couple of marches that I went to. Besides the youth strike, where young children, school-age children were there and were just cheering on everybody. And it was a very endearing experience. I'll tell a short story. There was this group of kids on the way to BAE Systems who saw the protest and then started running towards it, and they were chanting, "We want climate change." And I was like, what are they talking about? We want climate change. And it was so funny because they were so young and they like didn't understand what they were saying, and I was able to catch them and be like, you guys, you know, when you say that, it sounds like you want global warming. And then they like gave me their full attention, and I was like, you might want to come up with a different slogan. And then I heard their teacher chimed in, and then this young black girl actually was like, thank you for the advice, and they like walked off, and I had something to think about. So it was actually one of my favorite experiences, was just that brief interaction with these children. But some of the indigenous activism I saw, there was a very large fabric. Sorry, I didn't prepare a presentation with photos, but that was about let's say like 30 yards, and it was full of multicolored fabrics that depicted the cosmology of this Ecuadorian community around the Amazon. I'm sorry, I don't know their names, but they gave a speech, they explained the fabric, there's a bunch of people gathered, and then about 100 of us walked to the front of the blue zone and held the fabric and then splayed it out while they tried to get inside the conference because they didn't have badges. And so that was very beautiful. One artistic project that I want to lift up, if y'all can, you know, open up another window, another tab on your browser. There was a actor from the UK who I guess is in the TV show called I May Destroy You. I can't remember his name right now, but if you type in Can I Live? Climate documentary, you should see it. It's an 1.5 hour film about this actor's process of understanding climate change. Can I Live? If you can look that up, I'll drop a link in a little bit when I'm done talking. But that was a really moving process where he talks about his family, his experience as an actor, his experience being African in the United Kingdom, his experience of like finding out about climate change, trying to get involved. He talked about Ken Sori-Wawa, who was a climate activist I had never heard of, who was killed by the Shell company after they successfully pushed them out of their country. So which made me realize there's a lot of stories of climate activism that we don't get to hear about around the world, and especially in even the consequences from those successful actions. But yeah, I mean, I kind of left feeling two ways. One, very like nourished and connected and re-inspired, and feeling secure that like people around the world are very much united around this issue, and there are strong desires for peace and solidarity and sustainability. And then on the flip side, the understanding of the strategy of our governments, the United States and the United Kingdom, it's somewhat of a planned genocide. You know, they're protecting the fossil fuel industry from any kind of accountability, from being phased down and phased out, while at the same time expanding fossil fuel extraction. And as you heard, they're not paying countries to adapt who aren't responsible. They're not adapting at the speed that we need. We're not phasing this out in any kind of realistic term. And things are now, you know, this commitment to net zero by 2050, as we've already seen the climate impacts increasing at an alarming rate. The idea of getting to some kind of offset, but not literal carbon neutrality by 2050 is absurd. It's an utterly absurd prospect. It's a genocidal prospect. And somehow this dynamic has to break. You know, we have to break through to an immediate transition well before 2030. And yeah, it's just a grave injustice that things are even allowed to continue going on in any kind of business as usual. And one of the conclusions that I and others came to is that we have to put a lot of pressure on our government here in the United States. It's our government that is, you know, prioritizing military spending over any kind of real climate action. So shout out to Barbara Lee's resolution around bringing the military emissions into the fold, but we don't have a budget for war anymore. So that'll be all that I'll share. Know that the world is very much united around this issue, and the colonial paradigm has to break in order for us to move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Armando. I dropped links in there on Complicité, which is Can I Live, hip hop artist. It's been reviewed by many different British publications in French. Check out the video on his video channel there. It's an online digital tour now if you wanted to view it. And thank you again, Elaine and Sarah, for your words and contribution. Oh my goodness, for your words and contribution, speaking in the dark there, on the panel today. Next up, we will hear from, or we'll actually just take a short break, a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll hear from Los Angeles City Council Member Paul Koretz. And then we'll have words from Kia Chatterjee with US Climate Action Network, and then we'll wrap up for the day. But we'll take a 5-minute break. We'll reconvene at 10:45. And if Jack's got his finger on the dial there, we might have some music playing in the background. So please rest and relax for a little bit, and then we'll return in 5 minutes. Thank you.
I want to thank my son, Armando. Thank you. And Elaine and Sarah, that was amazing.
This is a little song I did last year in the holidays. It's to the tune of "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year." It's kind of summing up what we've been going through in the COVID. Here we go. It's a wonder that we lived through this year. When the COVID came calling, disaster snowballing from both far and near. It's a wonder that we lived through this year. We're so happy to just be alive. What with brutal cop beatings, too many Zoom meetings, it's been a rough ride. We are happy to just be alive. Now the climate's chaotic and Trump is psychotic, saying he won when he lost. There are scary cop stories and tales of the glories of partying when Trump got tossed. It's a wonder that we lived through this year. Economic depression and voter suppression, wildfires to fear. It's a wonder that we lived through this year.
All back, refreshed, had a sip of water. We're going to move into our next portion of our summit series. For those of you who have joined us in the interregnum, my name is Amos White. I'm vice chair of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force. This is our final summit for the year 2021. This one entitled United Climate Actions and Justice. It's part of our virtual summit series that we've been presenting on climate actions that governments, NGOs, non-profits, and individual climate activists and leaders like yourself can take to your communities, to mobilize your communities in this climate crisis. Next up, we have the privilege and honor to hear from Los Angeles City Council Member Paul Koretz, who we're happy to have with us today, representing District 5 in Los Angeles. Council Member Koretz is environmentally best known, as Cheryl just said, as for being the first council member to call for Los Angeles to move beyond coal and natural gas power, banning plastic bags, closing down the San Onofre nuclear generating station, and establishing efforts to protect biodiversity and wildlife habitat connectivity. He's also co-launched the effort to phase out neighborhood oil drilling. Yes, it did still exist in Los Angeles. If you've ever driven through communities there, I lived there from 91 to 94 and can attest to the oil drills that were still in operation in the city. And he's also instituted the world's first climate emergency mobilization office in Los Angeles, centered on environmental justice and launching Regenerate LA, a healthy soils jobs program targeting carbon sequestration, the storage of carbon as a means to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And with that, please welcome Councilmember Paul Koretz.
Well, thank you, Amos, and good morning, everyone. First, I want to say I'm speaking with you from unceded Tongva territory, and I want to acknowledge that the Tongva people still live on these lands. And thank you to Cheryl for inviting me to speak today. She's my climate emergency partner in the North. Anytime I speak about the wave of climate emergency declarations that followed us, I note and appreciate our partnership with Cheryl and the city of Berkeley. Before we took action, there were 3 municipalities in the whole world that had declared climate emergencies. After us, there have been a cascade of over 2,000 and counting. The rocks we threw together into the climate emergency pool continue to ripple to this day. And Cheryl, you continue that ripple also with your amazing son. You must be very proud. And that's why this series hosted by the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force is so important. We need to keep making splashes. We need to keep making ripples. And we need those ripples to keep building into waves of action until finally the entire population of the planet Earth is focused on the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. Obviously, we saw from COP 26 in Glasgow, the international community clearly isn't getting it done. It's the strange yearly game of kick the can down the road, but we're running out of road. Congress has a glimmer of hope with the infrastructure bill, but you can't light the world with a candle in the windstorm that is our contemporary Congress. Climate leader California has taken some bold steps and should be able to do much more. But for what I call the 3-party system that exists in Sacramento, I observed this while serving in the state assembly. It's Democrats, Republicans, and the moderate Democratic caucus. Why do we have a supermajority, but we see many good environmental legislation bills get defeated? It's because the Republicans and moderate Democrats combined together make up a majority of the legislature. The moderate Democrats only flex their muscles on a handful of bills each year, but many of them are key environmental bills. So the bottom line is, it's really up to cities to get it done because there's nowhere else where we can rely on it to happen. We've been working out exactly how to get it done on climate in partnership with Cheryl and her team up north, and in partnership with the LEAP Coalition here at home in Los Angeles. When we created the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, we did it with justice as a central tenet. The mission of CEMO, as we call it, is to engage with the communities most impacted, not only by climate disasters, but also by climate policies. And those include our indigenous, frontline, and labor communities. So our Climate Emergency Commission is going to be made up of members from those communities from the 7 most polluted parts of Los Angeles. The CEMO director has been designing what effective community assemblies will look like, and we'll be rolling them out early in 2022. And lastly, inspired by CEMO, our Department of Water and Power has now taken on equity and justice as an essential component in its 100% renewable effort. And I'm happy to say the US Department of Energy is paying very close attention to our LA 100 as a pathway for other cities and integrating justice into their thinking and planning. Now, if we could just move them out of the 2040s and into the 2020s for their emission reductions deadlines, we would be in decent shape. Now, while we're working on our climate justice pathways, we're also working out ways to right the wrongs that have been embedded in Los Angeles for over a century. Operations that are still causing cancer in LA neighborhoods. The LA City Council, like Culver City and like LA County, is working to phase out oil and gas drilling citywide. We'll be using an amortization process, which basically means showing that the oil companies have already recouped their expected profits over decades and decades of drilling. And they can't call our legislation a taking and sue us. So we'll amortize this over hopefully a very short period of time and then halt drilling in Los Angeles. What's important is that while we work to do away with fossil fuel production, we also need to work just as hard on doing away with fossil fuel demand. If there continues to be a market for fossil fuels, companies will find a way to provide them, regardless of the greenhouse gas emissions involved. What I truly appreciate with Cheryl's leadership is on aiming the city of Berkeley towards phasing out the sale of new gasoline-powered vehicles. We should stop selling them today. If you have lung cancer, you usually stop smoking. If your planet is on fire, you should stop pouring gasoline on it. We have to put collective pressure on Governor Newsom and the California legislature to stop allowing them to be sold. And I believe as California goes, so the rest of the country will go. Plastics also have an enormous greenhouse gas footprint and a tremendous environmental justice component. The oil and gas industry, seeing the writing on the wall about the end of fossil fuels and fossil fuel power, has spent something like $180 billion in recent years building new plastics cracking facilities to produce the raw materials for everyday plastics, from packaging to bottles to plastic bags. And you obviously know that China isn't taking our recyclables anymore. And we have to deal with them ourselves, which is probably how things should have been in the first place, especially since China was burning a lot of that plastic instead of recycling it anyway, continuing to create even more greenhouse gases. So we're working out a change in the whole system. The council is looking at an aggressive single-use plastics ordinance, and we're looking at the best practices from Berkeley in order to do so. Meanwhile, I just implemented a sister motion, which I co-authored, to end what I call zero-use plastics. Plastic utensils along with condiment packets and chopsticks that are given out with delivery and takeout from restaurants, which of course increased dramatically during COVID. And people usually just throw them in a drawer or throw them out right away because it's delivered to home. They have plates and they have utensils and they have condiments, so they have no real use for it. And so these are zero-use items. And they can't be recycled. Plastic utensils are too small, so it's not practical, it doesn't work, they just get thrown out. And while we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions across the board, we need to continue to protect our natural areas and create equitable access to them for everyone's mental health. We figured out during COVID how vital the outdoors were to all of us and our sense of well-being. We also need natural areas simply to keep us healthy and to keep our living creatures healthy on this fragile planet. Climate action without biodiversity protection will ultimately get us nowhere. Worldwide, we're seeing a mass extinction. So we've been fighting for the past 6 years in LA to complete an ordinance protecting wildlife habitat and the connectivity of it in our corridors in our hillsides. We're so close to completion, we could practically feel the mountain lion's breath on our necks, but we're still not quite there. And one developer and one real estate agent have created an AstroTurf organization that has some fake concerns, and they've been fighting us and slowing down the process. My overall goal is to protect as one interconnected habitat all the way from the rim of the San Fernando Valley, from Ventura County on one end to the San Gabriel Mountains and beyond on another end. Also, in addition to breaking our addiction to fossil fuels and halting the emissions, we also need to engage in what author Paul Hawken calls drawdown. That is, doing things that actively draw greenhouse gases down out of the atmosphere, which is pertinent to the regenerative aspect of today's event. Planting trees and using food waste and turning it into healthy compost that could be used throughout the city to create carbon sequestrating oil. And that's what I call Regenerate LA, the Healthy Soils Initiative that I introduced. And that's what it's all about. We want to find more locations on city land to develop composting operations. We want to make the best use of what's left over from anaerobic digestion after the methane is removed, which those in the industry call cake. We want to combine this with our organic parks initiative and use this compost and this cake across all city managed lands to reduce or even eliminate the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fossil fuel based fertilizers, and create safer spaces for children and park goers and birds and animals. And we want to educate Angelenos and our city staff on why it's so vitally important, how to do it through the lens of our biodiversity effort, and to do it with native plant landscaping. As part of the mission of our Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, we want to do it in a way that actively, aggressively creates jobs to replace so many that have been tragically lost during the COVID crisis, and those that will be lost intentionally as we move away from fossil fuel production and create a just transition for those workers. Lastly, the city of Los Angeles just competed with 40 other cities across California for the $1 million Cool City Challenge, and we won, as did your tiny but mighty Bay Area city, Petaluma, and remarkably down behind the orange curtain, the city of Irvine. What this means is the team we are helping lead will be working on a moonshot goal of getting Los Angeles to carbon neutral by 2030 without offsets, which is the strongest city goal in the country, and I'm confident that we can pull it off. We want to engage all the incredibly creative industries and people in Los Angeles in this effort, from the film industry to the video game industry to the design and advertising industries. These are people who spend their days and weeks creating artificial worlds to entertain us. We want to engage their powers just for a little while to create a healthy, safe climate future for all of us in this reality. The Cool Cities Challenge also had an innovative community engagement aspect to it. A few years ago, we launched a pilot project, which may have led to this challenge, called Cool Blocks, which is where one person in our neighborhood, or even in a large apartment building, agrees to lead his or her neighbors in a 5-month collective effort to reduce their energy, water, and waste, and to drastically increase their emergency preparedness, and along the way, build a stronger community. We just completed the pilot for something like 20 neighborhoods and found some remarkable results. At the end of the pilot, folks who had lived on their block for 40 years met other people that have also lived on their blocks for 40 years and they never ran into. At the same time, we reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but we also increased community cohesiveness and community resilience, which is so important to our climate impacts as they continue to worsen, from wildfires and atmospheric rivers and floods and extreme heat storms, and for those in at-risk areas, earthquakes. If we have a major disaster, we don't have enough first responders to go around. We need our neighborhoods to be ready to exist on their own for a week or 2 weeks, which means extra food, extra water, and backup power generation. And an unexpected test of our success, the week after our last cool block finished up in June of 2018, we had a record-breaking heat wave, which knocked out power to half of the block. Since they'd already mapped out who the elderly were, who the most at-risk people were, who had the biggest refrigerators during the emergency preparedness stage, they were able to keep each other safe and keep each other cool and keep each other from losing their food during the hottest week to be without power. After that, we knew that cool blocks worked exactly how it was supposed to. So best of all, with the emergency preparedness aspect, we were able to enroll people who we never expected to see get actively involved, help to lead the climate fight. So now with the funds from the Cool City Challenge, instead of 20 neighborhoods, we're ramping it up, and we will have 200 neighborhoods working on this beginning in January of 2022. And that's 200 neighborhoods in each of 3 California cities. So 600 neighborhoods, approximately 5,000 households all at once. And we want to expand this exponentially in the years to come. In Los Angeles, until we become a city working to do this citywide, block by block. This is truly the kind of mobilization our climate emergency mobilization effort is all about, and we're excited to see it spread to other cities. It's a nearly impossible prospect, but the prospect of not doing it is even more impossible. The children that have already been born could be our ambassadors to the year 2100. We want them looking back at us in admiration for what we saved, not in disgust. It's our job to ensure that we provide them with a safe future and a stable climate. And I'm so proud to be doing this in a strong and continuing partnership with all of you up north. And thank you for having me here today. And thank you for everything that you're doing.
Councilmember Koretz, we thank you so very much.
Thank you, council member. So wonderful to see you, and happy holidays.
Same here. And thank you to Cheryl, and thank you to all of you.
Good. Next up, we'll hear from Kia Chatterjee, who we have the privilege to hear from, who is Executive Director of U.S. Climate Action Network, USCAN, or USCAN, as some say. Kia is Executive Director of USCAN and author of the book, The Zero Footprint Baby. Again, author of the book, The Zero Footprint Baby, How to Save the Planet While Raising a Healthy Baby. Her work focuses on building an inclusive movement in support of climate action. Kia's commentary on climate change policy and sustainability issues has been quoted in dozens of major media outlets. Prior to joining USCAN or USCAN, she served as Senior Director for Renewable Energy and Footprint Outreach at the World Wildlife Fund, where she worked for 8 years. She was also climate change specialist at USAID prior to that. And prior to then, she worked at NASA headquarters for 4 years, communicating research results on climate change. Kia has been a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco and a board member of the Washington Area Bicycling Association since 2013. She holds a master's in environmental science and a bachelor's in environmental science and Spanish from University of Virginia. Please join me in welcoming Kia Chatterjee.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Sarah and Elaine had invited me to talk about USCAN. I want to take a second first just to bring in the news of the moment. I was actually at the Hill this morning when the Build Back Better Act passed, which was a real high moment for the day. And, you know, it almost felt too good to be true in terms of a good day. And in fact, it was, since we saw the Rittenhouse verdict come out, which is, of course, not surprising necessarily, that he was found not guilty on all counts for going into the street and shooting people indiscriminately, because the system will do pretty much anything to protect whiteness. But it is a sign of the challenge that we were facing at USCAN, certainly when I started, and that we're still facing as a society. And I wanted to start with that because we hadn't talked about it in this space, and I wanted to make sure we're aware of the challenge of white supremacy when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. And frankly, just even if all you care about is protest, this is a really dangerous outcome. And the fact that we have a judicial system that does not operate is puts all of us in danger. I believe that we would not have a climate crisis if not for white supremacy. I don't believe that we would have found a place to put coal-fired power plants. We would have found neighborhoods in which to drill, that we would have found places that we found, a willingness to sacrifice to put in exploding pipelines, dirty tar sands, whatever it is. I don't think we would have it without a system of white supremacy, not just in this country, but in the world, and a system of colonialism. And I find that, all of our issues have become more and more interrelated as we see impacts of climate change actually hitting us. When I started working on this issue, it was more theoretical. Well, what will happen when climate change finally hits? It will be so intersectional with housing. It'll be so intersectional with criminal justice reforms. It'll be so intersectional with every issue. But now we're experiencing that today. So Elaine and Sarah actually asked me to talk about the organization of USCAN. So I am going to try and do that. So US Climate Action Network is a network of about 200 organizations in the United States that are all climate activist organizations that play very different roles in the activism space. So some are the very large groups like the Legal Conservation Voters, the Sierra Clubs, the NRDCs, and the vast majority are grassroots organizations that organize at the local level. I started as executive director of USCAN a little more than 6 years ago, and I found an organization where the membership was predominantly small groups, but the people showing up were predominantly large groups that had mainly white middle class participants in their base. So if you went to the UN climate talks, if you went to COP, you saw people from large NGOs, almost all white, almost all men, speaking on almost every panel just 7 years ago. Similarly, when federal things were happening, the voices being quoted in the newspapers, the people who were there, who were being not people who were there, but the people who were being reflected as being there, were mainly white and mainly male. And so when I started the organization, I started to think about like, okay, well, how can we set up this network to be the kind of place we want our society to be? So we set up a new strategic plan where basically we said, first of all, we're going to have resources put out in a peer review way. So smaller organizations get resources, but there's no decision-making body that's separate from the people of color who are organizing in a grassroots way. The people who receive those grants are also on the review team. And so the way we end up doing it is that people receive 2-year grants. And so when folks are in their second year of their grant, they're on the review team for that next year. So we started doing that. We started purposefully saying, like, we really want Black, Indigenous, Asian, people of color to feel welcome and to be here. And so we are actually going to pay for their time because it is expensive to participate in coalition conversations. So we started a stipending system specifically for people of color to engage in our network. We also started making all decisions in a bottom-up decision-making structure using ranked choice voting. And so every year we get together, the last few years have been virtually, but we get together from across the nation, all the groups that are part of US Climate Action Network, and we vote on what our priorities will be for the subsequent 12 months. And that vote is done through ranked choice voting, and the ballot is set through a survey. So we just introduced a complete transparency as well as the kind of democracy that we wanted to see in society. Again, with the goal of thinking, what do we want society to look like? And can we begin to act that way ourselves within the climate movement? And so all of those changes took place about 6 years ago. And what we've seen is a pretty dramatic shift in, for example, who goes to COP, because all of our decisions are now put equity and racial justice at the heart of what we do. And we have a belief that it is by putting racial justice and economic justice at the heart of our work that we will solve the climate crisis. It's not just an and, but it's actually a process through which. we find that to be so central. And so what you find is that if you go to COP now, we give our badges, according to a very strict criteria. First to to Black and Indigenous leaders, then to other people of color. And we go through this process and grassroots actors, and we allocate our badges. So what we see now is we're now 6 years in, and I mean, I hate to tell terrible tales, but like, I will tell you, like 6 years ago, I guess that was 5 years ago, maybe, at the Paris Climate Agreement, there was a meeting with the US delegation where there were other NGOs that literally tried to keep the NAACP representative out of the room for the meeting, because they felt, well, she doesn't know all the lingo, doesn't know all of the, like things we're trying to get done, and hasn't been here for years. So we can't risk it. There's too much at risk. And that is the kind of thing that I believe makes us lose. And, it was such a great conversation about the COP. I do want to say something important about the COP, which is that it's not the world failing to act. It's not the UN failing. It's the United States failing. I want to be really clear about that, because the United States showed up at the UN with zero legislation. Build Back Better still hasn't passed the Senate, with zero legislation, just a promise of what they were going to do, acting terribly on human rights. Really, and why do we do that? Because the State Department is trying to negotiate in a way that that will be durable for multiple administrations. That means they're literally trying to negotiate in a way that can survive a party in power that we know to be fascist white nationalists. And when they go to do that, what happens is they say, oh, well, we can't concede this on human rights. We can't concede that loss and damage is actually happening and needs to be funded. We can't, and it becomes really hard to recognize that this is a party that we all elected. It becomes very hard to recognize them when they go into the international context. And that, I think, is another part of our strategic plan at USCAN that we were able to use to change the direction of the organization, which is to really take seriously our role as what we call the node of Climate Action Network International. So Climate Action Network International and USCAN were both founded in 1989. When all the UN climate talks started. And part of our goal when we redid our strategic plan was to say, we are really going to try to be better partners to the world. We are going to try to, stop talking about US exceptionalism and how important it is for people to understand what's happening in the US. And we're really going to try and have an attitude of deference to activists from the global South. So we're really listening to what they need and following their leadership. And that change of culture, took a little bit of time to take hold, but really, again, we see a massive difference in our movement today. Whereas, there's this whole, I would say, like, argument about outcomes and who calls it, and like, is it a success or is it a failure? And there's these competing narratives about any bill, any COP, and so we saw at this COP that, like, for the big organizations, they're very quick to, and I say that I'm talking about, World Wildlife Fund, where I used to work, or, any of the kind of like large, mainly white organizations. They really want to declare things a victory because it feels good, and they want to make friends with people in the administration. And that battle of narrative, we kept most of our members really calling it based on the way it was viewed from the global South and the way it was viewed from the most vulnerable people as a really quite a bad outcome, and that the United States had a very big role in that very bad outcome. And so that was also a big part of our transformation, making sure that we are really being good partners to civil society around the world. So Climate Action Network around the world has thousands of member organizations. We have a couple hundred here in the US. And we really try to make sure that our representatives to CAN International are grassroots voices, because whether we admit it or not, we have a global South within the United States of America. We have communities we treat as the global South who have the kind of metrics that exist in the global South when it comes to health outcomes, when it comes to education outcomes, et cetera. And so we make sure that those voices are heard when we go to speak internationally. And so that is the kind of gist of how we operate right now. So we're organizations, vote, we show up, at all levels. We also about maybe 3 years ago, it was pre-pandemic, had a group of our members come together and we asked the question of, why are we still losing? So our organization has existed since 1989. And we knew there was a crisis since 1989. And, in a big picture way, right, we all know the scenario. We all know what's going on, right? We know we have a moral obligation. We're not meeting. We know we have the technology. We know the fossil fuel industry is very powerful in preventing us from doing stuff. But really, why have we not been able to overcome that? And we spent about a year studying social movements, studying, the US civil rights movement, the Indian independence movement, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. We're very lucky that the executive director of CAN International, my counterpart, was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa and has a lot of personal experience and could share with us some of those experiences. We looked at what's happening in Chile, what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening around the world to really understand what is it going to take if we really intend to succeed at what we set out to do, which is to ignite an era that ends the climate crisis by centering racial and economic justice. And so we ended up launching in the middle of the pandemic something called Arm in Arm. Sarah and Elaine, who you heard from earlier, came with us on a bunch of Arm in Arm actions we've done. We've taken buses of folks from both coasts out to Line 3 to do actions in solidarity with the Anishinaabe tribe there. We have taken folks out to other pipeline and other struggles, and we have really started to do acts of what we call disruptive humanitarianism all over the country in a hub and spoke model within a 4-year plan. And our basic theory of change is that we need to have a movement full of people, and we need it to be, about 3.5% of the population. So there's some research from Erica Chenoweth, who's a social scientist, who was based out in California for a long time, who saw that actually, even when it comes to overthrowing dictatorships, when you have 3.5% of the population engaged, there are very few incidences of loss. They're engaged in a continued use of nonviolent direct action. And so we felt like, okay, that's a very clear goal. That's a number we can calculate towards, and we can move people towards that. And we need to have people power, but we also need to have political power. We need to have great elected representatives. We need to have political alignment, and we need to break through the current political alignment, which, if we're being honest, the people who kind of still define the common sense of this country include, white nationalists, warmongering imperialists, obviously the fossil fuel and pharmaceutical industry, we've seen very clearly in this last federal fight, and the kind of Christian right that doesn't want anyone to have power. The less white and the less male you are, the less they want you to have power. And that alignment really defines the common sense of this country and has for a really long time. And so it's really hard to get things past that. And so we actually know we need to create an alignment that's stronger than that, where we actually are not just a climate movement, but we are really aligned with the racial justice movement. We are really aligned with reproductive justice movement. We are really aligned with LGBTQ rights, but we have a really strong alignment across society that is strong enough to uphold the kind of change that we want to get. So we don't just have rollbacks after taking a few steps forward. And so we look at kind of the spectrum of change and what's needed. So I don't know if folks are familiar with the spectrum of change, but if you imagine kind of like a spectrum like that and little wedges, like on this side is the movement and on this side is the opposition. And when you look at any issue, like pre-win and post-win conditions, what you see is that, there's a big set of neutral people when you haven't won your struggle, and those neutral people become your passive supporters. Your passive supporters become your active supporters. Your active supporters become your movement when you win. If you think about an example like marriage equality, in a post-win situation, you don't have people who are neutral. So if you ask somebody in this country today, what do you think about gay marriage? And they say, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I've never thought about it. It doesn't even sound credible, because we created a which side are you on moment, and neutrals had to pick a side. Either it's love is love, or I hate gay people. And neutrals, because it was framed in a way, and it had a grassroots movement behind it, moved into passive supporters, et cetera. And so we actually believe in the power of which side are you on movement, moments. We believe in the power of nonviolent civil disobedience. And that's been a big transition for US Climate Action Network, is a belief in massive non-cooperation, and the need, and that we will have to do that if we actually want to have shelter and food and water. Like, I started my career working at NASA. I actually started working on climate change on one specific discrete day, because in 2002, when we got Arctic sea ice data, and I tell people that now, especially cryospheric scientists, the ice folks, and they look at me like 2002, because you can't even see 2002 in the ice data anymore, because in 2012 we lost so much Arctic sea ice that they had to change the graph. And so it doesn't look shocking, the moment that shocked me, but I went to my boss that day and I said, I have to work on this crisis. And I see it as a crisis, not because I care about ice, but because I was trained as an ecologist. So what I saw in that image of ice was people not having food, people not having water, people not having shelter, which we already see happening today. And here we are in the United States, where we had 13 cabinet members. Sarah was showing some of those pictures, 13 cabinet members plus a former president at COP. We had a dozen least developed countries and small island nations who could send no one to COP because of vaccine apartheid and because of the massive inequities we have in our world. So I'm just going to end with that, with just a call to action, that these are pretty big changes we need to go through in society, and it's gonna take all of us. So it's amazing that you all are gathering in this way already. We have a National Assembly coming up in February, which is pretty far from y'all, in Birmingham, but we have trainings every few weeks that cover anti-racism that are now required for all of our members, so that we are anti-racist as a climate movement. And I just put the chat and link, and any three people can start an Arm in Arm hub and become a part of this movement of doing disruptive humanitarianism, so that we as a movement can win for all of us, and that to me is also, to go back to the beginning, securing a country where we have actually dismantled white supremacy and decolonized our movement and our country. Thank you.
Kia, thank you so very much. And I'm pronouncing it right. Is it Kia?
It's Kea.
Kea, that's what I thought. Thank you, Kea. And thank you again for your contribution, for your work and all that you've done. And for those of you who do want to follow her, please check her out on our program, and the links there to her, and follow her on social media as well, as important work that she continues to do and offer in this space. At this time, we will move towards our latter part of the program. We have closing remarks and wrapping up. We're a little bit ahead of time, which is always good, but it gives us a little more time for to visit our toolkit. Jack Lucero Fleck, who is on our steering committee and co-chairs our planning and logistics committee and I must take a moment here, if you don't mind me, just a point of privilege. We have a member who has been very dear and highly contributing, and here from the start since 2019, who has not been with us, suffered a medical emergency just about a month ago, and has been, his mark has been made in helping us organize this and move this forward. I must take time to just take a pause here and think of who is recovering, Steve Nadell. If most of you who are aware of him and or notice he's not here, Steve has been in recovery, and hopefully will be back with us soon, but please keep them in mind, keep them at the fore of your thoughts, and check in with him via email to send good wishes and wish him a speedy recovery. So Steve, we're thinking of you. With that, his co-chair of the Planning and Logistics Committee, who will take us into our
Excuse me,
toolkits. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Sorry, I was just wondering if, since we're running ahead of schedule, if anybody has any questions for Kia, since we have time.
Go ahead there. You can unmute yourself if you have a question and raise your hand there. We'll take our first one from Jack, but if you do have a question, go to your reactions in the bottom of your screen, click raise your hand, and we'll identify you. And if you have a question for Kia, or drop it in the chat and we'll ask it from there.
Yeah, I just see that Paul Koretz is still on the call. And Paul, I'd love to hear your response to Kia's presentation. What do you think?
Well, I think it's certainly a big part of the problem. I'm not sure if it's the whole problem, but it certainly points up my greatest fear that we have an election coming up in 2024 where I fear it's possible Donald Trump could be reelected. And in my view, 4 more years of Donald Trump will possibly translate to the end of the world, literally. 4 years where the federal government once again goes backwards and tries to create a fossil fuel infrastructure and strengthen it, I think is just the ultimate disaster. And I think the Republican Party is largely the party of white supremacy now. There are some at the edges that are just traditional conservatives and are not as focused in that direction, but they seem to be pulled by the rest of them and are not willing to drop their loyalty to the party. And it's somewhat frightening. I think if things don't change and we don't figure out a way to market the values of the Democratic Party in a positive way, we are likely to lose control of both houses after December. And then it's a question of whether things get worse and we're actually run by Trump and 2 Republican houses. It's a very frightening thought. And how we combat white supremacy and the party of white supremacy, not entirely obvious to me. So I know we need to keep moving in this direction, keep doing what we're doing, but I think we also have to keep that in mind as a primary focus. If we lose these elections, it's going to be tough to recover from them.
Thank you for that. For me too, I just want to say that it's super frightening because racism is alive and well, or unwell, really. And we really have to, all our white allies really have to take a step back and pause and think about what changes you can make within yourself and your friends and your family to change this trajectory that we're in. Because, people of color, BIPOC folks have been dealing with this all my lifetime. I'm 65 years old. And, and right now, who would have thought it would be getting worse? But that's what they wanted. That's why they had that 45 in the White House. And we can't let that happen again. So really, really take a pause and think about how you yourselves can make a difference and take that action to change. Thank you. Go. I think you had something to say. Go ahead, Kaya. And there was a question from Alicia Carter. has her hand raised. Beth and Elfie. Or I can't see that. Sorry, I'm botching the name. So
I just unmuted myself. I'm Alicia Carter and I'm new to this group, but I do have a question for both of your guests who I appreciate so much everything you said, because we can't, all of these issues are so bound up with each other that I don't think we can divide anything out of it. But but my question is, as inadequate as Build Back Better bill has become from what Biden originally intended, I still think that our passing it is so critical because of the huge amount of money it's going to go towards climate change. And I'm just wondering if either of you have advice about how we can support it from California, where in the Senate, where our senators are both probably going to be voting for it. And I'm involved in a group that writes letters and postcards on various issues, but we often say, well, there's no point in writing to these guys from other states who are, so conservative, because they're not going to want to hear from us. But do you have any way of getting around that and what we can do to help this thing get pushed through now?
I don't know. I know there's an effort off and on. I haven't really kept track of who's behind it, to focus on, for instance, swing votes among the Democratic Party. A member here and a member there that are on the fence in other states, and encouraging people to call their offices. I mean, I know as a longtime elected official, if 500 people, and this has happened to me with a couple of the right-wing radio stations that have never particularly liked me, they'll say, well, Paul Koretz is doing this. Let's all call his office and let him know what we think. You get 500 calls at once with one person answering the phone and one person as a backup, and you sit up and take notice. You don't necessarily even have time to record where they're coming from. So I think calling into a representative who's on the fence. I know there's an organized effort to do that, and I honestly can't remember the representative's name. But I have gotten emails about it. Certainly wherever we can find a pressure point, even if they're not in our local congressional district or in our state, I think it's a lot better than nothing if you take action. So I think we should be doing that to the extent we can. Put a little pressure on Nancy Pelosi as well, just to make sure she realizes that this is a top priority for the whole country and that we're all watching and pushing for it. How much it helps, who knows? But the other alternative is just sitting back and not doing anything. And I would think the better choice is trying to figure out what we can do.
Yeah, thanks. So at this point, I put in the chat the number and the website for calling. I do think it's still worth calling. I also think it's still worth calling and writing to Leader Schumer. Ultimately, he will decide whether to put Build Back Better on the floor of the Senate. Just to be clear, there is one person holding this up, Senator Manchin, and I honestly believe at this point it is totally not a bad idea to point out that this person is completely conflicted. He literally gets a check from a coal company. That's his income. I'm not even talking about political donations, which are atrocious. I'm talking about literally he gets a check. He drives a Maserati, he lives on a yacht, and he, for his entire adult life, has represented a state that is 50th out of 50 in almost every health and wellness outcome. This is not a person who represents his constituents. And I think we're at a point where it's good to expose that. And we can do that through storytelling wherever we live. So yes, call, email, whatever means of communication you have. At this point, nothing hurts. We've all been at this for a long time. and they've gotten lots of calls, but I also think it's important to expose the incredible level of, hypocrisy and conflict of interest at play here to the public, so everyone's really clear on what's happening here and who is preventing this bill from moving forward.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Beth, you have a question, your hand's raised. Go ahead there.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a question I'm passing along from the chat to Kaya. And this is from Herb Bearstock, who's asking about how your national network can kind of connect with and share examples with local organizations like the CEMTF, so that to sort of partner with us or help us go beyond education and advocacy. And Herb, if you have something to add to that question, you can just jump in.
I don't know if Herb wanted to jump in. Yeah, so I shared in the chat the link to that Google Doc, and I made it public. And that's, we do have trainings. We have like intro and 201 trainings monthly that are open to anyone. Obviously, in your case, you have EFC West is a member, where Sarah and Elaine are affiliated, is a member of US Climate Action Network. And so that's an easy way to bring in resources. And any organization, we're not like trying to grow, but because we're pretty huge already, but any organization can apply to become part of US Climate Action Network, and any individual can become part of Arm in Arm. You just have to have 3 people. You have to have 3 individuals to set up an Arm in Arm hub. But we've really tried to make the barriers to entry and information very, very low. So like literally anyone can sign up for a training. It's virtual. You can do it from wherever you are, because we need 3.5% of the population. So to get to 11 million people, we want to make it super easy.
Good, thank you. Beth, you can lower your hand there. Are there any other questions that we have? Oh yes, I see Sheila Jacobs and then Alicia Carter.
Thank you, Amos, and thank you everybody for this incredible webinar. My question is specifically about the DOJ. I listen almost every day to Glenn Kirshner, who retired from the DC office after a 30-year career as a prosecutor specializing in homicide and mafia cases. And he's been on television as an expert, and he's been attending various things. And so I would really like to know from both of you about your perspective of why the DOJ hasn't yet prosecuted Trump, and whether you think they will, because of a million reasons. Thank you, Sheila.
Paul, I see you taking a breath there.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the agency to know how many folks are interspersed within it that have those loyalties and are trying to prevent it. I don't know how much of it is a tendency, even on the Democratic side, of wanting to get past the past and just move forward. I know that made it difficult for an effort that I led in California to impeach George Bush a number of years ago. And there certainly were many reasons why he deserved to be impeached. And I introduced a motion to do it. We had a number of co-authors. Basically, Nancy Pelosi reached back into the state and encouraged the leadership to squelch it. So the item was never heard. Without a doubt, if it got heard, it would have been passed by the Democratic majority. So I think there's probably behind the scenes a tendency to want to just leave it alone, get past it, stop fighting with Trump and move on. But he had such a criminal history, and even the way that he was able to bury that while he was president and manipulate the process is just amazing. I never thought we would see a presidency that was able to have so much control over so many things, and where a president could do so many things to enrich himself while in office, and of course before he was in office, illegally, and get away with it. It really is something I never would have envisioned. And in fact, the fact that we would be nostalgic for George Bush and wish that we had a little bit more normal president like him. In retrospect, is an incredibly scary thought.
One that upholds and honors the rule of law and our democracy. I'll point back to your own words, Paul, earlier, where you said, and I take this to heart, as many of you probably do as well. You've put it pretty bluntly: our democracy is still at risk until these individuals are fully prosecuted, and this tone has shifted dramatically in the actions of congressional leaders and others as elected officials. Kaya, I know you wanted to comment on Sheila's question as well. Go ahead there in regards to DOJ at all.
Yeah, it's not totally a direct response, but I think it's important to also understand like where the Biden administration's orientation is to think about the DOJ response. And so earlier this week, we had the largest leasing of oil and gas permits that has ever occurred. A massive body of land. This is this administration doing it. Why are we still struggling over Build Back Better? It's a complicated procedural set of things that happened. But when the House passed a great transportation bill and sent it to the Senate, the president decided it was more important to advance bipartisanship than it was to pass a climate bill. And that's how we ended up with that infrastructure bill first. And I think that there's a real belief in like, oh, well, we can still work with these guys. That's at play, or else you wouldn't have had this bipartisan infrastructure bill as such a big priority that it actually set back climate action. So
you still believe that the Democratic Party pretty much, and with the president's actions and leadership, is pretty much in crisis, choosing, if you will, not partisanship, but taking a path of political unity and the belief that they actually can ideologically and or do the same if they've done before, reach across the aisle and try to pull the government back together, or versus taking a harder, stronger tact and leading with a climate initiative?
Yeah, and I think that, the question in the chat here from Bruce also alludes to this. Like, I very much agree with Paul that there's a very high likelihood of the Republican Party taking over in the midterm elections. And I think that there are different strong views about how to prevent that. And one is, let's speak the truth, say what's really happening, and call a which side are you on moment in this country, and really force the discussion. And another is, let's continue to not disturb, that political alignment that I talked about, but get what we can within that alignment. Leave the alignment alone. Like, let's not try and like stop forever wars, because that's a step too far. Let's try and like appeal to that climate change is gonna hurt the Defense Department, and the Defense Department can help us. And so I think that there's just these two different views. I think that probably a lot of us agree that we're at a crossroads in this country. Like, are we going to become a fascist white nationalist nation, or are we going to maintain a multi-ethnic democracy? And I think that I don't know that we know what's right or wrong. I can tell you from studying movements and from studying what you have to do to create the kind of fast and deep change we need on climate, there's very little, reformer only tactics that get that kind of fast and deep change. And when I say reformer only, I'm referring to Bill Moyer's framework on the different roles of activists, and that there are certain reformers that work within a political and economic and social system. And then there's other change agents that are trying to change that political and economic system. And there's always tension between them, even though both are needed. And so we have to learn to work together around these different types of activism, but there are genuinely different theories of change about how we prevent slipping into a white nationalist fascist country.
Right. And that's what we're not dodging, but trying to identify and pursue in our efforts to both restore climate and to influence policy and these policymakers. Let's move on to Alifi. I know you had questions there. You can unmute yourself.
And first, if I could jump in for just a second and apologize, but I have a noon physical meeting a ways away from where I am. So I'm going to have to profusely apologize and say bye to everybody, and thank you for this great opportunity.
Thank you so very much for your time and your participation and for your service. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Alifi, go ahead with your question there. And pronounce your name for me, please, if I've been mispronouncing it.
You're doing it right. Alifi is good.
And you're a little
you-
close to the mic there. It's garbling. Go ahead there.
Oh, is this better?
You're much better. Go ahead.
I wanted to thank everyone too, and especially Kaya, I think I said it right, Kaya, for really calling out the intersectionality of anti-racist work has to be part of anti-fossil fuel work, the environmentalism that isn't getting through to either party. I was so uplifted by the two speakers who went to COP26, Armando and I forget her name before that, Sarah, because even though it wasn't a good outcome, we the people, the grassroots level, can make some good outcomes happen. We have to. And I don't really feel that energy anymore as this devolves into blue versus red. Are we going to go back and forth, blue versus red, blue versus red? And those of us who were never expecting Cinema or Manchin to act blue, they're not going to change. They're on their own campaign trail that is for their little teeny pool of constituents who are funding them, and their coal miners who are funding them, and they're gonna stay, shall we call them purple, although I hate to taint the color purple, but the two parties have merged, and when they excluded Bernie and any other third party candidates, we became a one party state country. And that's what was trying to waffle at COP26. So I appreciated Kaya's ideas of any three together can start doing civil disobedience. I mean, we gave them all the chances we could. We waited 5 years since Paris. We pushed and pushed at the COP26 2 weeks, and they didn't do it. So now we have to do it. It's time to stop business as usual. And how do we form these pods of civil disobedient activism together that are anti-racist and pro-environment and making pipelines stop, coal mines stop, Chevron stop, pollutants into the bay stop, and actually get something done? Because it's depressing to say, let's go back to politics as usual. No, let's not. That's all.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Any comment from anyone on that, Kaya, or we can move on? Good. Good. You're open. All right. Well, with that, and thank you again for your comment, Alifi. Really do appreciate that. I should say, moving forward from a very rich discussion, I do want to thank everyone. One, for your time today. It means a lot to us. This has been 2 years of, it's not a labor of love, it's a necessity that we've pulled together. We're collaborating, and we're calling on governments, NGOs, individual activists and leaders like yourself to not just take this, consume this, because it's on the web, because you've got time on a Zoom and it seemed interesting, or you like the congresswoman or the council members or what have you, but to really take what's coming up next in regards to the toolkit, the links that are offered there, the resources, and some of the tips and links that have been shared with you in the chat as well. So take this forward. And I hope this has been very enriching for you to take those back, more than just in heart, but as a package of action items that you can sort through to see what's best for you and your community. With that, we're going to hear from Jack Fleck again, who will present on our toolkit and recap the toolkit, and then introduce our evaluation survey that we're going to drop a link here in the chat for you. Just a quick survey to fill out. It's not just getting a pulse of where you are. It'll help us shape, if you will, the future, both of this organization and what we bring forth in our next year's not content, but series of events and activities. So please take a look for that link. And then third, I'm going to ask the council member or former council member, Cheryl Davila, if she can find the link to our donations page. We are, we're not organized as a nonprofit. This is a joint venture of citizens and organizations and elected officials coming together to make, please, if you will, Cheryl, drop that link and or with your elected official, if you're a staff member here today, or with your organization, or make a donation yourself. Any little bit does help. It helps us pay for some of our speakers who we do offer an honorarium when we have the funds. And it helps us as an organization continue to do the work. So if you can, please visit that link as well. With that, Jack, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Amos. This has really been a fantastic morning of ideas and presentations, and I really encourage people. One thing that I've done over the last 2 years is I go back and watch these on the recordings, and people's presentations are so full of ideas. It's just been fantastic. The first year, we came up with over 250 ideas that our legislative team, which is Elaine and Cheryl and myself and anybody else who wants to come, occasionally other people come as well. We tried to winnow it down into these toolkits. So this year, for each of the summits, we've had a toolkit. And so today I just put in the link, sort of a summary of all those toolkits of local actions that cities can take. And in listening to Paul today, I was like, wow, he was just like a walking toolkit. He just was so full of ideas like, okay, phase out the drilling of fossil fuels. That's a resolution that cities and counties can take. Work on the drawdown aspects, the composting the cities can do. That's another idea that we've talked a lot about. Working on the demand side so that we really promote electrification of buildings and of transportation and make sure that we streamline solar. These are all ordinances that cities have passed around the country and in California, and that we think every city should pass. So we wanted to put together like a matrix of like, how is your city doing? What's the scorecard? How have they been doing? And so I urge you to take a look at this. It's still a work in progress. We are really able to add things. And like I say, Paul was so full of ideas today. I want to go back and listen to that and add all the ideas that he had. And then also, like Cheryl says, Cheryl was taking the leadership in Berkeley about passing a resolution saying that racism is a climate emergency, and that's something that all cities should, is an emergency, a public health emergency that all cities should address. And then the very simple act of putting the acknowledgement of which indigenous people's land you're on when you come into a city, like Berkeley has done, to say, welcome to Ohlone territory. This is like something that every city can do, costs practically nothing. And it does show that we need to respect the indigenous lands that we're on. And we have so much to learn from the people that lived here in harmony with nature in a sustainable way for thousands of years. And here in a couple hundred years, we've messed it up completely. So anyway, I do urge you to take a look at the toolkit. And then, as Amos said, we have a survey that we would like to ask you to fill out. I'm going to put it in the chat again. The survey is specifically asking where we should go from here, what ideas you have, what things you think your cities can do for further climate actions, what things has the Summit Series inspired you to do? We'd like to hear if you've been taking actions based on some of the ideas in all these workshops. So it's been a very rich experience doing all these summits, and I just want to thank everybody. I have fun with these songs. I have to just can't resist saying my song for this year is "You're a Mean One, Mr. Manchin." So to the tune of "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch," because he seems to be poised to really block everything we need to get through this Build Back Better Act. But we'll see. Maybe there's a soft spot like Mr. Grinch in his heart. Okay, so I think that's about it for me. What have we got, Cheryl, or who's next?
Take it. I'll take it. Thank you, Jack. And thank you again, everyone, for being here. I want to thank the Congresswoman Barbara Lee, the civil rights attorney Pamela Price, Sarah Diefendorf, Elaine McCarty, Armando Davila, Councilmember Koretz, Kia Chatterjee, and the CEMTF Steering Committee, the Planning and Logistics, and everyone who volunteered to help get this series going. And thank you to all who attended today and attended the whole series. And thank you, a special thank you to my son Armando, who Googled climate emergency and demanded that I take this on. And did so much work for me and helped me get through my council term, and continues to get me to work on climate. And I'm so proud that he went to Glasgow. That's incredible presentation that he and Sarah and Elaine put forward today. We have so much work to do and so little time. And we have to realize that we can't do any more extractive practices. We have to end racism. I know that's kind of hard, and when white supremacy is on the rise, but this has been the problem throughout my lifetime. We have to change it. Allies, do your part. Everyone has to do their part when it comes to the climate. We have to take whatever little steps we can. Recently, someone sideswiped my car. It was parked, thankfully, and nobody got hurt. 2 cars got totaled, the car that hit me and my car. So now I am going to get an electric vehicle or a hybrid or something, hopefully. So we have to do whatever we can, recycle, reuse, help out our unhoused folks, just say hello, bring them some water, which they always need. But we need to humanize. We are all humans, and we have to realize that we are all humans and humanize people because they are human. They are not something different. People that are homeless have had circumstances that led them to that. And we have to be compassion, have empathy, and all these struggles that we all face today. Our climate, everything. So please do your best. And I appreciate that you all came here today. And I am so blessed that the series was very successful as far as I'm concerned. We've had amazing speakers. It's just been a whirlwind, and I can't wait to go back and review some of these presentations as well. And right now we don't have a donation link on our page because our fiscal sponsor is not able to handle that, but one day we will be able to do that. But right now you could still go up to the United Climate Action Eventbrite and make a donation if you choose. But I appreciate all that have done so already. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year. There is not going to be a CEMTF general meeting in December. We're taking that month off. But the next meeting will be in January. I think it's January 19th. So we'll see you then. And we look forward to that. And we look forward to our future. And we have to make the future bright for everyone. So love yourself. Love your friends and your neighbors. Reach out to someone. Say hello. We're still in our mask, but our eyes will tell the story of how you're feeling. So we have that, because if you're smiling behind your mask, your eyes are smiling too. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the holiday season. Be safe. Wear your mask. Keep up the fight. because we have to. Our lives dependent on it, our children's lives, and hopefully one day my grandchildren's lives. They haven't gotten here yet, or there's none of that yet, but one day I hope. And for you too, we have to look out for our future and the planet. Please take it seriously. And you guys have a blessed day and stay healthy and be safe. Thank you all so much. Right on.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Power to the people.
Thank you.
So
everyone.
wonderful to see everyone. Bye, y'all.